From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis jokes, or at least I think it was a joke, about maybe building a prison next to Disney World as the Supreme Court takes up a case on how flexible employers must be in accommodating religious workers. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnists Alicia Finley and Kim Strassel. The feud between Disney and Governor DeSantis seems to be turning into Hatfields and McCoys, and the latest were some comments this week from Governor DeSantis at a press conference talking about what was formerly known as the Reedy Creek Improvement District, this special district surrounding Disney World. Here's what Governor DeSantis said.
One of the things they tried to do was put restrictive covenants on the land that the district owns. So if you look at this whole special district, Walt Disney Corporation obviously owns a lot of it, but the district owns other land. You know, quite frankly, I wasn't even thinking about that land. This was not something that was really important one way or another. We just wanted them to live under the same rules, pay the debt, pay the taxes, all that stuff. Oh, but come to think of it, now people are like, what should we do with this land? And so, you know, it's like, okay, people have said, you know, maybe have another, maybe create a state park, maybe try to do more amusement parks. Someone even said, like, maybe you need another state prison. Who knows? I mean, I just think that the possibilities are endless.
Alicia, what do you make of this? And why do you think that Ron DeSantis wants to keep fighting this war?
So I think to backtrack, if you recall what happened last year is Disney publicly criticized the state's quote-unquote mislabeled Don't Say Gay law, which basically merely restricted the instruction about sexual identity in such matters in K through 12 and required that any other instruction be age appropriate. Now, so Disney came out and attacked the law. So the state fired back, or Ron DeSantis fired back, and they passed this law that removed a lot of special privileges that Disney had previously enjoyed under this kind of special district, and essentially allowed it to govern itself. And it included some tax and regulatory privileges. Now, in February, the Disney, in a kind of a bureaucratic vote, essentially clawed back a lot of its ability to self-govern itself. And DeSantis, I wouldn't say he was asleep at the wheel, but he wasn't paying attention. The notices of what the Disney was doing, it was publicized. And they were in newspapers, but DeSantis was probably preoccupied with other political or policy matters at the time, and so was his staff. And the media found out about it, and they started mocking DeSantis for essentially being duped by Disney. And he did not want to look impotent. He didn't like the media mockery, and he didn't want to appear weak. And so he started firing back at Disney and escalating this kind of war, tit for tat, with the company. And perhaps he's trying to channel Donald Trump's pugilism and show that he's a fighter. But I think it is also, he's feeling very insecure and on the defense. And so he feels like he needs to go on offense right now.
But notable that this is becoming a point of contrast between Governor DeSantis and other potential candidates for the Republican presidential nomination in 2024. One of the first was Mike Pence. He said in February, going after Disney's taxing authority, quote, that was beyond the scope of what I, as a conservative, limited government Republican, would be prepared to do. Chris Christie this week said something similar, saying that he thinks the job of government is to stay out of the business of business. And then even more notable is that famous Floridian Donald Trump saying this on Truth Social: Disney's next move will be the announcement that no more money will be invested in Florida because of the governor. In fact, they could even announce a slow withdrawal or sale of certain properties, or the whole thing. Watch, that would be a killer. In the meantime, this is also unnecessary, a political stunt. And Kim, I do find it a little bit amusing, the idea of Disney trying to do a slow withdrawal of Florida after spending decades building what is a huge agglomeration of capital amusement parks, roller coasters, not the most mobile property On the other hand, does Trump have a point there that DeSantis is really picking a fight with one of Florida's biggest, most famous companies, one of its biggest employers?
So I agree. I don't think that Disney is going to up stakes and move, for instance, to Texas or somewhere. Not likely. This is decades and decades of investment. But I find the Trump attack really fascinating because I've been waiting for it in some ways. And I think it's really a very interesting insight into what some of the battles between Trump and DeSantis may become in the future. And I think it's also a little bit of an interesting liability for Trump in that, think of it this way. If you look at what attacks that the Trump team has leveled on DeSantis so far, it's clearly come from team strategic meetings, a sort of well thought out plan about how you could best undermine DeSantis. And so that's why you've seen these ads coming from Trump's super PAC going after him on past remarks he made about reforming Social Security and Medicare. The thought there is that there are a lot of Americans, even in the Republican base, that are very concerned about anybody messing with these retirement programs and that this could weaken him. What you saw with Trump's comment was instead Trump being reactive, which is a very Trumpian thing to do. And he's coming out now in defense of Disney, essentially, because he sees an opportunity to pile on DeSantis along with the media. Now, think about that for a second. I get it. We can have a discussion about whether or not Ron DeSantis has gone too far in some of his comments. I think that that was a joke he was making about the prison, but the wisdom in general of escalating this. But the bigger reality for Trump is that there are millions of Americans out there who are very uncomfortable with some of Disney's policies and its outspokenness when it comes to some of these issues of parental rights. They haven't been happy with Disney, people canceling their Disney channels, etc. This is particularly relevant among conservative voters. Does Donald Trump really want to be in the position of being on the exact same side as Disney? Because again, he's not very nuanced about this. He's essentially like, are you for Disney or against it? It's a much more complicated question than that. But it's the kind of thing that I am wondering if this isn't going to continue happening. And Donald Trump is going to be in this interesting position where every time the media trashes on Ron DeSantis, he might feel an opportunity to jump in, even though where the media is in this criticism is not necessarily where voters are. Now, I think that's a little bit different than the criticism that was coming from Pence and Christie and others. I think there they are trying to draw some real policy distinctions about where Republicans should be right now on the question of corporations. Just how populist do you want to be, which DeSantis has been moving that way. That's a bigger, more interesting debate. But I think that the Trump reaction was very knee-jerk and is very interesting.
But it does strike me as a tricky balance that Ron DeSantis is trying to walk here. And some of the original reporting when this fight first began last year suggested that this Reedy Creek district was a benefit to Disney, obviously, but also a benefit to Florida and the local taxpayers. So recall what happened here was the legislature initially passed some legislation to abolish this special taxing district. And, the mayor of Orange County was saying that the result of that was that upkeep would fall on the county and there was some debt that might fall on the county. And so when the legislature passed that bill and it was going to eliminate the Reedy Creek district in 2023, June 1st, my thought was that this was a shot across the bow to Disney and there would be some way that this would get hashed out and settled. And that is kind of what happened, because instead of abolishing the district, Florida, the state government, basically took it over. And now its members are appointed, instead of by Disney, they're appointed by the governor. And so there was a little bit of hedging there on what the initial response to Disney was supposed to be. The other thing that I think is notable to think about here is that companies are still covered by the First Amendment. And I don't know if there's a First Amendment case that Disney could bring against the state of Florida here. And part of what makes that difficult, I think, is that what Florida's talking about is taking away special benefits, a special taxing district that other businesses don't have the benefit from. On the other hand, there are all sorts of CEOs in blue states that speak out on taxing issues or crime in Chicago. And to the point that Pence and Chris Christie are making, I don't think conservatives would look very kindly if blue state legislators responded to those criticisms from CEOs by trying to make it even harder for those specific companies to do business in those states.
I think that's right. And the irony here is that Governor Gavin Newsom has had its own run in with Disney and Bob Iger. During the lockdowns, Disney was very vocal and Bob Iger was very vocal in criticizing California's lockdowns. Disney ended up moving, I think, a few thousand jobs from Los Angeles to Orlando. Newsom was very unhappy about that. And there were actually rumors circulating at a time that Bob Iger might challenge Newsom for the governorship because he was so ticked off and, the electorate was so upset about the lockdowns. Now, that's just a little bit of a tangent, but it indicates that businesses are criticizing blue state governors for other things, as you mentioned, in terms of lockdowns, taxes, and actually in some cases, there is retribution you've seen, and not always as explicit as has been the case here, in which DeSantis and the Republican legislature very pointedly removed any kind of special privileges for Disney. Again, as you pointed, the fine line here is that these were special privileges and perks. And arguably, a free market person would say, well, they shouldn't have existed in the first place. But when you remove them indirectly, seemingly in response to companies' political position or opposition to something that the legislature does, that does kind of implicate First Amendment rights of these companies. Be curious, actually, if the case were to ever to go to court, where judges would come down on that. Now, going back to where Republicans should position themselves here, they should probably be on the side where Mike Pence is. I don't say Chris Christie because he did his share of bullying too when he was governor in New Jersey, if you recall. But I think they should generally be non-interventionists and not bully businesses. And that was something Trump actually often did. That was something Obama did. If you recall, that Trump actually, when he was campaigning, really went after Carrier for moving jobs to Mexico. But really, make it clear that these are business decisions. But on the other hand, businesses probably should stay out of politics when they don't have a clear business interest. And as is this case, Florida Don't Say Gay law doesn't directly implicate Disney's ability to operate or, profit in this state. Unlike tax or some other economic policy.
Kim, we'll give you the last word on this topic, but it does strike me that this is a potential weakness for Ron DeSantis if he gets into the 2024 race, is that sometimes he makes these populist swings that, to my eye, I'm wondering whether they're actually connecting. And maybe the best example is this investigation that he has launched on vaccine makers during COVID-19. But this Disney fight might be another example. As a matter of political realism, I understand why Republicans in Florida felt some need to respond to the criticism from Disney that they were breaching human rights in the state of Florida. On the other hand, here we are a year later, and they've already redone this Reedy Creek district. And I think maybe voters will find themselves wondering, are we still really having this fight? And did Ron DeSantis, I get it was a joke, but is he really threatening to build a state penitentiary next to the Magic Kingdom?
Well, this is going to be the area to watch with Ron DeSantis, and not just on the question of how you handle corporations, but on issues of immigration, on issues of national security. There's an element within the conservative movement that really responds to this kind of populist rhetoric. And I think it has benefited DeSantis to some degree to have shown his willingness to stand up to some things that many across the party find wrong or problematic. But the reality is that the conservative movement is going to respond far better overall. And by that, I mean the people that you also need who are suburban Americans, people in the center, to a very well-defined philosophy that hews to free markets and free people. And we'll see if he lands there. Again, I think that he's a little bit taken by the idea that sometimes this gets him in the news, the headlines, but it's a place where a lot of other Republicans are going to beat on him for. And it isn't necessarily a place that is where the majority of voters are. Okay. Again, headlines. Yeah, you might manage to get some of those who are really angry head up. He does need to show that he can fight. I think that's obviously that he has. But, on the other hand, I think that There is a pretty straightforward place for Republican candidates to be that is both principled, which is that no, if you're a corporation, you don't get special privileges. You don't get sort of special perks, especially if you are engaged in all kinds of activism that is repugnant to many of the taxpayers who are providing those perks and benefits. By the way, I think all governors should get rid of them for all companies anyway, other than in very broad tax policy that applies to businesses across the board. But also, I think there's another way that you can both promote business and leave them to do their free market decisions, but also just to say, hey, we as Republicans, we're not necessarily going to be there for you when you come begging with your lobbyists for special things that you need done here or there. I think that's a very solid position to make, which is that we're going to provide an equal playing field. And if you, in particular, are going to be out there playing in politics, we might not be there for you when you're asking for special perks, which, by the way, I don't think people should be giving anyway. So there is a place for Republicans to land here that is both principled, but also lets voters know that they are not in the tank for corporations that are working outside of basic business norms.